I welcome you all to the online day of our conference, Out of Sight, Out of Mind, Unwilling Attention and Neglect in Humanitarian Action and Global Health. The first 1.7 seconds decide whether a video is watched further. The attention of the average audience is that of a ferret after a triple espresso. I am sure that this pessimistic assessment by communication experts does not apply to you, but it does emphasize a serious point. Attention is the currency of the present. It drives media coverage and advertising. The opening sentence already described it. Attention is a scarce commodity. In our fast-paced, interconnected world, the concept of attention has taken center stage. It is influencing the way we perceive and respond to humanitarian crisis. The allocation of attention, whether driven by media coverage, public interest, economic factors, or political influences, wields immense power in shaping the course of humanitarian and medical efforts. It is a force that can either illuminate pressing issues or perpetuate systematic inequalities, all depending on who holds the spotlight. The digital age has ushered in what we commonly refer to as the attention economy. The shift has created new challenges and opportunities in understanding the dynamics and attention and the narratives that underlie society's engagement with humanitarian crisis and global health concerns. The last 2 days explored how economic, political, and humanitarian actors' interests shape these narratives. Sometimes silently critical issues like protected crisis, neglected diseases, and gender-based violence. Today we will dive deeper into these topics and we will have 3 exciting sessions. At the beginning from 11:30 to 12:30, you listen to a session on the topic Feel-Good Narratives for Harsh Realities, the origins and consequences of oversimplification. This session will look at the implications and consequences of humanitarian actors using oversimplistic and corporate messaging for fundraising and attention to complex crises. After a coffee break follows from 1 to 2 p.m., Notorious Ignorance, Anthropology and Attention to Humanitarian Sector. This panel discussion explores the dynamics of unequal attention in the humanitarian sector and its implications, drawing on anthropological critics to reshape the future of humanitarian aid. At the end, from 2:30 to 3:30, we will listen to a session on social media, activism and advocacy, advantages and limitations. This panel aims to discuss in depth the strengths and weaknesses of social media and online activism, drawing a comparison with more traditional forms of activism, and finally exploring the question of advocacy on behalf of other communities through online means. As president of the Berlin Chamber of Physicians, I want to take a moment to express my deep appreciation to this year's host organization and partners. Doctors Without Borders, Doctors of the World, and the German Red Cross. I'm sure that I speak on behalf of the representatives from the main office of our chamber when I say it was a great honor to organize this important conference with you once again. Thank you to all involved. Our partners this year are Hilfe zur Selbsthilfe, Handicap International, the Network for Humanitarian Action and the Center for humanitarian change. I would also like to thank the volunteers and everyone who has worked tirelessly behind the scenes to bring this event to success. Your dedication and commitment are the driving forces behind our collective pursuit of knowledge and change. I encourage each one of you to actively engage, ask questions, share your insights, and most importantly, listen to the diverse perspectives of the online day. It is through our collective wisdom and shared experiences that we hope to find the solutions, practices, and strategies that will pave the way for a more equitable and compassionate world. Once again, a warm and sincere welcome to everyone in our audience and our upcoming speakers. Let's embrace this opportunity to learn, connect, and work together to address the pressing issues of our time. Thank you, and let the conference begin.
Hello, good morning, everyone. We'll come back to the video and we'll start with our keynote session. And it's with my utmost pleasure to welcome you to the keynote session on the online day of the Humanitarian Congress. My name is Badra Yusuf Ali. I am the Managing Director of RAAGSAN, a local social enterprise based in Somalia. And as all of you are aware of, the Congress theme this year is out of sight, out of mind, unveiling attention and neglecting the humanitarian action and global health. If we use a plain and simple language, when people cannot be seen, it's easy to forget them and their suffering. And this is also a direct result from the reduced interest of the media and the public, the politicians in certain crises. The shift in attention and neglect also means that donors and policymakers will no longer make a priority to support those communities. And as a result, people affected will not receive adequate support. This is something that we have been discussing the past couple of days here in Berlin during the on-site Congress events. Today, we are joined here by Gathara, a senior editor for Inclusive Storytelling and the New Humanitarian, an independent media platform reporting stories on conflict and disasters affecting the millions of people living in humanitarian crisis across the world. And Patrick will talk to us about how we conceived ideas about humanitarian crises, emergencies, and responses influence how we identify and talk about them. The first 2 days of the conference, we discussed about how biased narratives, proliferation, and modification of news and data affects the work that we do as humanitarians or as journalists on the ground. So Peter will talk to us about, the work that they're doing at the New Humanitarian to challenge that discourse. And Peter, over the past 14 years, I was also working in the humanitarian sector, and I've seen how that affects the work that we do and on the ground. So please, Peter, welcome to do your keynote speech. Over. Peter, if you can unmute yourself, we cannot hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. Thanks, Badra. Thanks for the introduction. As she said, my name is Patrick Gathara. And I thought today I might talk about how we talk about humanitarian crisis. The title of my talk will be sort of a reversion or a flipping of the title of the conference. So rather than out of mind, out of sight, out of mind, I think I want to talk about how being something being out of mind leads to it being out of sight. So that how we think about what a humanitarian crisis is influences how we respond. It influences how we identify crisis and can lead so many times to us ignoring crisis and also proposing solutions that might actually worsen the situation on ground. I thought I might start with something that I had written a few years ago, just a short description, and see whether you can identify what country I'm talking about. So in one of the countries hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, an oil-rich nation of some 300 million people, including a large Muslim population, more than 1 in 5 households do not have enough to eat. Even prior to the pandemic, the situation had been dire, with nearly 14% of the population dependent on food aid, with 1 in every 6 children not having consistent access to food. The situation is today complicated not just by disease, which has claimed tens of thousands of lives, but also by tribally driven political unrest and fears of bloodshed should the results of fast approaching presidential elections be disputed. Now, this was a situation in the US in June 2020. Did anybody describe it as a humanitarian crisis? If this was happening in other parts, would it be described as a humanitarian crisis? What do we mean by those terms? And do we apply them the same way when the events that happen in what is called the West, as opposed to when they happen elsewhere? My contention is that actually we don't. So when we have wildfires in Canada, for example, that displaced 200,000 people, that is not called a humanitarian crisis, even when Canada appeals for help across the world to tackle it. When people in the UK have to choose between heating their homes and buying food, we don't define that as a humanitarian crisis in the same way if it happens in Somalia, for example, we would. And I think historically the reporting of humanitarian crisis has created several problems. It bifurcates the globe. It presents the world as divided between a competent West that doesn't really suffer crisis, and the rest of the world that does. It misrepresents many times what crisis actually look like. So can you think of the images that come out of humanitarian crisis that present communities almost as flat, as everybody is a victim. Everybody suffers in the same way. Everybody has the same need. So everybody is starving. Everybody's in a refugee camp. Everybody's waiting for food to be brought to them from outside. And it focuses a lot on the Western response. So when you talk about humanitarian aid, we talk about humanitarian agencies, so agencies based in the West, but that will then come in and provide aid. And this ignores both local agency and actually the situation on the ground. 2019 ODI report showed that what is called international humanitarian aid comprises less than 2% of what of the resources that go to people in crisis, and even in people in the worst crisis, 2%. So why is it that our idea of what a humanitarian response is many times is the Western aid worker, when most of the resources will come from either locals, people helping their own communities, neighbors helping neighbors, will come from the region, other countries helping around, or from diasporas. That's where lots of the aid comes from, But we still have this idea that's presented that aid comes from outside and specifically from the West. And this sort of reporting can also prolong crisis by misinforming response, so that when we present countries and communities as uniformly impacted, we many times fail to see that sometimes it is one section of a community that is impacted, and perhaps the problem isn't so much that there is no food in the country, but perhaps where it is grown, it is not able to be transported across. So I'll give you an example. Many times in where I live in Kenya, You've got situations where you've got hunger in the northeast, drought and hunger, but you've got bumper crops in the south. So that the problem isn't that we need aid brought in from the US or elsewhere, but perhaps we need to be figuring out mechanisms for getting aid from where it is grown within the country to where it is. And if we do bring in aid, does that not then create a disincentive for farmers in the places where it actually works to keep on growing crops by depressing their prices, by making it uneconomical for them to do this? So, and the other thing that we also need to think about are the root reasons of why communities cannot cope, and how the reporting again obscures this. It's presented almost. Lots of the crises that we have these days are chronic. They last for many years. They keep repeating over and over. But there's little discussion about why that is the case. We are presented with drought as for example, a reason. But what about our trading systems and how, over a period of time, the global system has essentially made communities unable, or has diminished their capacity to cope with natural events? So these are some of the ways how we present crises can change, and how we report on them, is really influenced by how we come up to see them, how we approach them, and I think this is where the decolonization of reporting is important as a thing. So Chimamanda Adichie spoke of the danger of a single story, and I think a lot of what we have to do is to unlearn what we have been taught about what to expect when you go into a crisis, especially as journalists, and we've got to increase the perspective. We've got to ask a question: who is reporting about whom, and for whom? Many times it is about stories from what is called the Global South being reported on by reporters from the Global North for audiences in the Global North. And that has completely changed today. The media audiences are being globalized. Expectations of what you're reporting are different from what it was in times prior to the internet, the rise of the internet and social media. So we really have to challenge the perspectives that we are giving. We have to challenge the language that we use and the narratives that we propose, and we've got to understand that today it's not just about speaking to one set of people in one place. It's not about speaking to donors and potential donor countries. You're talking to everybody, and everybody can now talk back. And I think as media, we are finding that many times the narratives we are giving out are being challenged, So what does decolonization involve? I think it's several things. First is decolonizing the newsroom. So the diversity within newsroom, who is talking, so it's no longer just the foreign correspondent who jets in or parachutes into a crisis and then reports back home. We need to have diversity in newsrooms. You have to have local perspectives, local reporters talking about the places that they're in and giving nuance to it. But that's not enough. It's not just about diversity. We have to ask, what are we covering, in itself? When we go into a crisis, what are we looking for? Is it just the images of suffering? Or are we trying to present a nuanced picture? Do we talk about the lives of people within this crisis, how they are coping, where they're getting resources from, where there are spaces that are not necessarily impacted as badly or at all by the question that we speak of? What formats do we use? How do we tell these stories, and are they in ways that can be internalized by or understood by audiences across the world, or is it just for a small audience? Whose perspective do we privilege? Who do we interview? Who are the quote-unquote experts that we speak to? I find it quite interesting that it is rarely the people who actually suffer the crisis who are considered experts in it. It is people from outside, who tend to speak about it. And finally, as I said before, for whom is the coverage? Are we reporting about these societies for other people, or are we including the people suffering crisis within our context, within our idea of who our audience is? And that's all bounded within the idea of journalistic ethics. How we tell stories, who we tell them to, what are the values that we are utilizing, that we're borrowing from to tell these stories. Traditionally, media ethics has been something that grew out of the West, and it's been spread around the world. So it's not just to say that it's Western journalists who report badly. Kenyan journalists speaking about, in Nairobi, the capital city, speaking about a crisis in the Northeast, tend to use the very same terms that Western journalists would. So this is a global problem about how we approach things, and I think the solution to this is for us to think about a global media ethics, whether that is possible, whether we can actually get together as journalists and figure out how do we tell better stories. The New Humanitarians have been trying to think about this from discussions about how we define a humanitarian crisis, to how we cover it. We've been experimenting with different formats. So utilizing, for example, poetry as a way of people to explain their reality in a way that's not necessarily covered by the 800-word format that most news outlets would use. We've got a project in Yemen that's very interesting, for the Yemen Listening Project, that would urge you to have a look at, where we give space for people within Yemen or people who have links to Yemen to tell their side of the story. And if we look at the content of those stories and you compare it with what journalists normally would put out about Yemen, it's very different. It presents life in Yemen. And this is the other thing to understand, that life happens in this crisis, So just having this flat idea of suffering, a lot of times it's actually misrepresenting what's going on. We did the same thing in Lebanon, where we used WhatsApp texts to try and explain how people were responding to the issues there. So it's really important for us to rethink how we do journalism, and this comes with challenges. It is not easy. There is no global model at the moment of journalistic ethics. It's going to be a work in progress for us to rebuild it, for us to share what we think we already know, and so that we can be open to what is new and how better we can tell stories and represent a crisis. I think my time is over. I'll just stop there, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Yesterday, we also talked about this a lot, and about how humanitarian journalism ignores, the responses from local actors, and also glorifies the aid that is coming from outside. And in your recent articles and also this keynote, you also talked about how the foreign aid dominates the international limelight. We are obviously struggling to overcome the biased way of reporting. You talked about several recommendations that can be adapted, but I was just wondering, what should the governments of the affected people do about this? Because, we complained about this for many years, and I've seen also that the civil society and local actors, local NGOs and activists, people who are affected these issues directly, have challenged this way of reporting, but it looks like, there's not enough of listening to them, because the reporting system is still dominated by big agencies with resources. We've seen that a lot in Somalia, and you obviously also highlighted what you see in Kenya, and I'm sure also in many other countries, and will resonate with that. So what should the government do about that? And I'm also asking this question because we often see that agencies talking about, countries in which are in the main context that, the government saying that they actually don't trust the data that's coming from the field, and they think, yes, there are issues, there are droughts, but it's not really at this stage whereby the agencies are saying it was. So how do we balance that? How do we build trust? And what is the position of the government, or what should be the position of the government in this?
Well, I think the position of governments is in the same way or we expect them to deal with media in general, which is essentially to encourage a proliferation of voices, and to give space to a larger and a wider array of people who can speak about this. But unfortunately, in many spaces, governments are the problem. Governments are trying to minimize the ability of people in crisis to speak because they are more concerned about their political objectives and their political well-being rather than in actually fixing people's problems. They're trying to fix their own problems, politicians. So I think for us, it's really to push to have people, to give people more greater ability to speak, to represent their own reality, and to not simply have it curated. When you speak about international agencies, about international media, and I would add in this local media as well, especially local national media as well. These are agencies, these are spaces where people's stories are curated, where somebody who's not necessarily suffering this crisis decides whether it is important enough to go on, decide what is the image that represents this, And for a lot of times for people on the ground, what is presented is not necessarily what they are going through. So I think having spaces where people can speak more, I think the internet is a really good resource, but we have to obviously consider the issues with misinformation and disinformation. There might be some space for regulation there, or that's a discussion I think we need to have. But I think the goal should be to proliferate perspectives, to have it such that it's not just one set of people who decide what the reality is for everybody else.
Thank you, Badra. I think, yes, as you said, the government will have to encourage that, but also obviously come up with a way to encourage, a better way of reporting, and also give more accounts they say, but also sometimes I believe the resources as well, because we have seen, a lot of African governments not really putting attention into that and really, the collection of data and reporting to external agencies and mainly the UN and international NGOs. So I kind of feel like personally that, we don't really see the role in all of this apart from, as you said, complaining and putting on the table some of it.
Yes, if I may, I think I would agree that it's the role is not simply to stay away. It's not simply to say, oh, keep off the media and let people speak, but it is to facilitate as well. So it is actually to provide the resources so that local people can speak and express themselves. So governments have to be deliberate within this, and we've got to push them to be deliberate because they are the custodians of lots of common resources. This is not money that belongs to the governments, and it should be used for the benefit of people. So yes, I completely agree that it's not just stay away, but facilitate people to actually speak out, people especially in crisis. And I think also for agencies that go in, unfortunately, lots of humanitarian agencies have agendas when they are telling stories. So they're trying to raise funds. They are, they're trying to keep themselves in business. And unfortunately, many times that means that they misrepresent what's there. When it doesn't tally necessarily with what they have. And I think they've got to ask themselves serious questions about how they curate the stories that they tell. And how they utilize the data that they pick from these communities, and whether they are being honest and true in representing the situation, or whether they're simply representing their own interests.
Yeah, Badra, so we have 3 minutes. Let's check if we have questions coming from our participants online. I can already see a question about how do you see the potential for citizen participation in this context?
Well, I think, as I said, citizen participation in 2 ways. First, in basically providing the stories, so uncurated stories. I think a lot of times the role for mainstream press should be really verification rather than simply curation. I think that the advent of citizen journalism, the ability of people on the ground to share their images, to share their reality, to talk about what's happening to them, I think that's important. But it has also to go beyond simply the short 2-minute engagement that we get. The world cannot be fitted into 800 words or 2-minute bits, So we've got to encourage people to also be more, to tell their stories in a more fuller way, in a more wider perspective, so that then we come out with, I think, a more holistic idea of what's going on in spaces, rather than sort of the way we have been conditioned to think that it's only when we have explosions or when we have starving children that those are the only images that matter, And we've got to think also about audiences. Who are we encouraging them to speak to? The second thing I think citizens can do is simply put pressure, both on governments and on news outlets. I think the internet has been a really good space, especially social media, to challenge what the media does. Before, if you had a problem with something that was published, you wrote to the editor and you hoped that he published your newspaper, your piece. Today, you don't have that. You can put out their thoughts already on social media. They can challenge directly the narratives that are being put forward. And I think the more they do that, and the more there's pressure on media to get their stories right, the more there's pressure on governments to correct their propaganda and correct the narratives that they put forward.
Thank you, Patrick, for joining us. This is definitely an interesting discussion that we should continue. We'll be now moving to the first session of today, which will start in a minute under the theme Feel Good Narratives for Harsh Realities, the Origins and Consequences of Oversimplification. Please stay on the line, and thank you for joining us.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me.